Hello, everybody. How are you all? Welcome to your fourth quarter. I know it started a little bit before the break, but the break has definitely been longer than the actual quarter so far. We have about 35 to 36 more days of school until the last day. I hope you all had a wonderful break and enjoyed the time and the Easter with your family. Hope you're connecting with friends virtually and whatever else you guys are doing. I hope everybody's in good health as well as their families. It's good to be back. It's good to interact with you guys again. Please pay attention to Google Classroom because we are going to be switching things up a little bit and changing our format as we move forward. And I have some different ideas on there as well. As always, I'm open to feedback, so feel free to email me at any time and let me know what you think. And as we kind of go through these different platforms that we're going to use, um, let me know. Give me some feedback. Let me know what you think and if it's working and if it's better. It's definitely going to require a little bit more work on your guys' part, but I think that you can all handle it. And you've had the last number of weeks to kind of chill and relax a little bit. So let's kick it up a little bit. We got some really cool stuff to talk about. Big push to the end of the year. And what we're going to talk about today is the culture wars, and more specifically, we're going to talk about the Scopes trial, which some of you may have heard about. It's the Scopes monkey trial. Now, let's first talk about culture wars. So, if you want to talk about culture wars in today's context, things like gun rights, abortion, birth control, climate change, those would all be examples, bigger government, smaller government. It's sort of the competing views of the different social groups in society. So if you want to look at it as conservatives and liberals, or older people and younger people, or Democrats and Republicans, or rural versus suburban and city, those would kind of be where the value divide is in America. Now, let's think about it, right? Your grandparents, who are probably in their 70s and 80s, they don't understand what Instagram is and what Snapchat is. They probably don't approve of the way you dress. They probably don't approve of the music that you listen to, or the movies that you watch, or the language that you use, or how fast you drive, or whatever it might be. Think about the difference. You're 16 or 17 and they're 70 or 80. So the world has changed dramatically during that time, naturally, but also as a result of technology. So they don't approve of what you do and how you live for the most part. And you guys are living very much in the moment, which can be expected. So this has taken place in every decade and every time period throughout history, where the old wake up one day and they look down and look back and they say, I don't understand this society anymore. Now, the 1920s is radical change in culture in America, right? We've got the rise of technology through the radio, and the radio now connected America in a way that it never had before. So the radio becomes the TV becomes the computer and the internet, and the computer and the internet became the smartphone, and tagged in with social media. People that lived in the early part of this century, or excuse me, in the 1900s, they don't understand. They would never understand what is going on today. All right. Now, if you look at some of these issues, think about guns. All right. You have anywhere from people in this country that think there should be no guns, to anywhere in this country where people think that you should have 27 AR-15s with unlimited magazine capacity. That's a pretty big difference. And if we look at guns, right, what's the damage that a gun can do in a place like New York City versus a place like, I don't know, Oklahoma? Think about the density. Think about how close people live to each other. It makes sense that somebody in New York City is going to have one view of a gun, and Oklahoma people are going to have another view of a gun. And they might both be right and they might both be wrong. But you can't possibly expect them to think the same when it comes to guns because of the context and the situation that they live in. So that presents a culture war. All right. Now, the more media there is, and the much bigger increase in speed of media, if you think about it today, that can take the culture war and amplify it. Because if I'm just putting my view of a gun in a newspaper and someone else is reading it, somewhere else in the country, now I could post my views about guns on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat every minute of every day. So then if I'm an anti-gun person, let's say, and a pro-gun person starts to read my Twitter feed, they're going to freak out and say, "Oh my God, look what's going to happen to our society. If there's one person like this, there must be many, many more." Okay? So that's just to put it in more of a modern context. But if we look at the 1920s, city life, right? Women are more single. They're dressing differently. They're smoking and drinking in public. They're sexually involved with more than one partner. All right. Think about what's happening to family values. If you're a preacher in Alabama and you hear a song on the radio and then you match it to a picture in a magazine of a woman with short hair smoking a cigarette, you're going to turn around and go, "Oh my God, uh, God is gone, okay? The devil has taken over, and we need to dig our heels in because fundamental Christian values are being threatened." All right. Now, what's going to bring all of this to the forefront of the American conscience is going to be the Scopes trial. All right. Now, let's just define for a minute here. Fundamentalist people believe the literal truth of the Bible, which means that if the Bible says that you take an eye for an eye, then you take an eye for an eye. All right. Now, Christian fundamentalists today would believe that Jesus walked on water. Jesus, turned what was it, fish and bread into wine, and I don't know what it was, but whatever he did, that it was word for word the literal truth of what Jesus Christ actually did. So today we would call Christian fundamentalism as evangelicalism. You hear that word a lot. And in another context, we have Islamic fundamentalism, which would be Al Qaeda and ISIS, where because the Quran says to take 25 wives, they take 25 wives. And because the Quran says to behead the infidels, they behead Christians and Jews because they consider them infidels. They're taking the religious word step for step. Okay? There are plenty of religious people who are more I guess you could say moderate in the sense that they believe that Jesus did good things, but they believe he was an amazing person, but they also don't believe that he ever walked on water. They believe that that might be an analogy to show how special he was. So there's a wide range of views when it comes to religion, and that can often shape the way that we see society. Okay? Now, modern versus traditional, fundamentalist versus, what could we call it, more realistic, I guess you could say. All right. Now let's move on here. So the Scopes trial. Tennessee public school teacher is arrested for violating a state law barring the teaching of Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, we've talked a little bit about Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm assuming survival of the fittest, natural selection. It basically says that human beings evolved from apes. Now, if that's true, then the Genesis story in the Bible that Adam and Eve were created by God, I forget what day of the 7 days, and that all human beings then descended from Adam and Eve, those two things don't work together. Okay? Now, in a place like St. Anthony's, I think ninth grade you learn about the Old Testament. Now, I'm sure you did study the story of Genesis. And I don't really know the theology teacher's take on it, but in ninth grade, a lot of you are in biology learning about Darwin and evolution, okay? And then you go to theology class and they tell you that it's the book of Genesis and this is God's word. Now, it can only be one or the other. Now, today, especially in Long Island, New York, there's a very enlightened way of thinking about this where we accept both of them in a place like St. Anthony's. But back then in the 1920s, you taught Darwin in a public school. You were spreading the devil's word, basically, and science and religion were not to come into conflict with each other, because if science won, people would be less religious, their value systems would go out the window, the American system would fall as a result, and anarchy and chaos would take over. So John Scopes is going to be a biology teacher who teaches the theory of Darwin, and he is going to be fired and then arrested. He is going to sue. The press is going to pick it up. It's going to become a national sensation. Now, the radio is what's going to bring it all together, because now in every corner of the country, if you had a radio, you could tune in to hear about the details of the case, the arguments, the reactions, and everybody started to form an opinion. Now, when everybody forms an opinion, over a very, very controversial topic: a culture war can ensue. So we have our two. Now think about it this way. So the radio is to the Scopes trial what the TV was to the O.J. Simpson trial in the early 1990s. I was in middle school when that happened, and it was crazy. Everybody had an opinion. I remember when the verdict came out, I think it was in 1994 and 1995. I was in 8th grade. And the entire cafeteria full of what, 11, 12, and 13-year-olds erupted because there was a verdict in this sensationalized case. We all watched OJ and the Ford Bronco fleeing the LA police. It was crazy. So America shared that through the TV. America shared the JFK assassination through the TV. America's going to share this case through the radio. So we have our two groups: Christian fundamentalists on one side, who are the evolutionists, versus the evolutionists with feminists, socialists, modernists. They wanted to substitute their own value for the word of God. So basically, they're saying that their value system was put there by God. They didn't create it themselves. But these enemies, these imposters on the other side, they are creating their own judgment without really being told what to do. Now, on the other side, we have our evolutionists, where freedom meant the right to independent thought and individual self-expression. This law showed the danger of religious intolerance and the merger of church and state. Listen, those two groups still exist in America today. They're some of the loudest arguments that go on in this country. Conservative, family, religious, traditional values versus modern, secular, freedom, thought, expression. And a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. You don't have to be all one or all the other, depending on if you're rural, if you're southern, if you're religious, if you're traditional. That literally, how you're raised is going to determine kind of where you are in this dichotomy. Now, renowned labor lawyer Clarence Darrow is going to represent Scopes. The trial's highlight is when Darrow calls William Jennings Bryan to the stand as an expert witness on the Bible. They kind of get into this death struggle back and forth, Christianity versus science. Darrow kind of gets the better of him in court, making him look silly because he goes against his literalist interpretation. Eye for an eye. Somebody accidentally does something to you, does that mean that you deliberately do something back to them? So there were holes to be poked in this literalist interpretation, and Darrow kind of gets the better of him intellectually. Now, if you remember, William Jennings Bryan was the populist presidential candidate in 1896. So he is a rather famous conservative in the country, and Clarence Darrow is a lawyer who is going to eventually be on the Supreme Court. Now, the jury is going to find Scopes guilty, but the Tennessee Supreme Court is going to later overturn that verdict and make it innocent. The fundamentalists are weakened. They stop fighting publicly. They build their own schools and communities. So they really believed that if the courts were going to come down against them and traditional values, that they would remove their kids from public schools. Now, if you think about homeschooling today, okay, there are many of those parents that don't believe in the values that the teachers purport in the public schools, okay? And a school like St. Anthony's exists because Catholics were discriminated against when they first got here. The Protestants didn't really want to have much to do with them, so they kind of broke off and did their own schools. But St. Anthony's definitely has an aspect to it where I've heard parents say, I send my kids to St. Anthony's because I know there'll never be a same-sex bathroom there. Now, I don't know if public schools have same-sex bathrooms. I don't go in public schools often enough to be able to tell you that. I don't know if they ever will, but there's definitely the feeling that St. Anthony's, pushes traditional values, the values that your parents want you guys to have, the values that their parents wanted them to have, okay? So I have some pictures here. That's John Scopes, who I actually dressed up as at a Roaring 20s party back in January for the new year. I had to dress in 1920s gear, so I dressed like this man. I had that straw hat looking thing on, and I wore a name tag that said John Scopes. That is William Jennings Bryan, so he defended the fundamentalist traditional side. And that is Clarence Darrow, who favored the modernist side. Now, 3 Ku Klux Klan emergences in this country. 1860s as a result of Reconstruction, This is going to be the second one. The third one's going to be in the 1960s and 50s and 60s in response to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. Now, this Klan is going to be different. They are going to hate more different kinds of people because the country's getting less white, less Christian, okay? And then, of course, you can tie that in with fundamental traditional values leaving in certain parts of the country, mostly cities. So this Klan is going to be more about not just disliking black people, but this Klan is going to be about disliking Catholics, disliking Jews, disliking feminists, even giant corporations, unions. All of this is going to be a problem for them. And they are going to be active with violence. They are going to be active with hateful propaganda and the spreading of hate speech throughout the country. They're going to be very, very out there. Remember, this is the golden age or the beginning of the golden age of advertising. Everybody, whether you meant for good or meant for bad, you could use advertising in order to push your agenda and get exposure. All right? Just think about it. Do hate groups? Sure. Groups about peace and helping people, they're all over social media. But there's plenty of hate groups on social media as well. You could do a quick search on Instagram or Facebook and find all sorts of Klan and neo-Nazis and God only knows who else out there pushing their agendas. Okay? So they claimed more than 3 million members, all white, native-born Protestants. America for Americans. And these were not your backwoods hillbilly types that we think about the Klan today. These are highly respected people, police officers, judges, lawyers, and name it. I'm sure teachers, okay, name it, and you could be part of the Klan. It's going to take deep roots in the North and the West this time, not just the South, okay? So you are going to see them in New York. You're going to see them in Atlantic City. You're going to see them in Chicago. They're going to be against all of these immigrants that have been coming into the country. Remember, native born means those who were born here. America for Americans. We have some pictures of them marching in Washington, D.C. America first, one God. And remember, there was just like the slave owners used the justification of God to justify why they owned slaves and why they were in one spot and the slaves were in another. Same thing, all right? And you see it today with hate groups. They use as a reason that God intended them to do this, that they are doing God's work by hating a certain group of people for whatever reason it might be. Now, closing the golden door, we're talking about immigration here. America has always been a nation of immigrants. America would not be America without people coming here first from a foreign place. They were not born here. They came here, they established themselves, and they prospered. We got the Irish starting in the 1840s and 1850s. We get the Germans. We get the Italians. We get the Russians. We get the Jews. We get the Polish. We get plenty of Scandinavian people, Dutch people, French people, all coming from Europe, all looking for more opportunity, okay? Now, that is going to start to change. We just fought a world war. We fought against countries that had sent a lot of people here, and that created a problem in the country because a lot of people took different sides of the war, and you can't have that when you go to war. You need people to be pro-America, okay? Now, union radicalization. That's going to become a problem for large manufacturers. And they looked at that as largely an immigrant problem. Okay? So they are going to start to pass anti-immigrant legislation. Now remember, when the country is building, late 1800s, early 1900s, they want immigrants because immigrants would work for nothing. They were desperate, they were vulnerable, and they would be willing to work for nothing. So they were allowed by the boatloads to come over here with no papers, no criminal background checks. You wanted to come, you showed up at Ellis Island, here you are. Here's a job, here's a terrible place to live, and go do your thing. All right? But in the 1920s, we have conservative governments. We just fought a world war. We want to start to limit the amount of immigrants that come into this country, and we also want to limit where they're coming from. If you remember, Northern and Western Europeans who were taller, blonder, blue-haired, more white-skinned, they were desired more because that's who looked like the native-born Protestants than the Southern and Eastern looking immigrants who were shorter, darker hair, darker complexion, darker skin. So, Emergency Quota Act of 1921 limited European immigration. Immigration Act of 1924 barred more Southern and Eastern Europeans, making sure the descendants of old immigrants would always outnumber the children of new immigrants. Think about it. America is electorally a democracy. We vote by numbers. So if too many Italians come in and they bring socialism with them, or too many Jews or Russians come in and they bring communism with them and unionization, they can really, really sway power, take money out of the hands of the top, change who our government officials are that will benefit them. And they don't want that to happen. So they want to make sure that white, let's say Germanic, English, Scottish, Irish looking people remain the majority in the country. These laws created the idea of the illegal alien and the illegal immigrant that you guys know of today. The Border Patrol police started to deport those who were detained. So the argument over immigration in terms of how many, who, and from where is going to start to kick up during the 1920s. And since you live today in the 2020s, you know it is still going on. Now, immigration goes away for a while. It's not a hot button issue, but it's part of the culture wars today. Okay. As you saw in 2016, Donald Trump made immigration one of the biggest parts of his platform. And that kicked up a big conversation about where people are coming from, how many, how are they getting here, how are they being tracked, all of that. And I guess it's died down a touch, but it's going to, I would imagine, it's going to also be another big thing in the 2020 election. All right, now the emergence of Harlem. If you remember back to the end of the last unit, we talked about the Great Migration. You limit immigrants, right? So the most vulnerable people in the working class are gone, or they're limited. There's not as many of them. So black people started to move to northern cities from the South. Now remember, after the South, they got freedom, and that's about it. Jim Crow and segregation severely limited their social mobility abilities completely. If you can't vote, you can't get change. And if the established order is going to keep you down and keep you poor, then there's no way up for you. And this went on for decade after decade after decade. Now, when the immigrant pipeline starts to be limited in northern cities, now factory bosses, manufacturing industrialists are willing to now hire black people in droves because they're the next most vulnerable people. So you're replacing one vulnerable class of immigrants in these cities with a new vulnerable class of blacks from the South moving up to seek more opportunity. Okay, so the Great Migration after World War I doubled the black populations in New York City and Chicago. New York's Harlem becomes the black capital of the United States. Southern newcomers and immigrants from the West Indies, some were educated, white collar, but just like the problems in the immigrant neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, we're going to see the same sort of thing. Widespread poverty, low-wage jobs, housing discrimination, exorbitant rents, white landlords and business owners still running the show. So few blacks are actually going to see prosperity in the 1920s, but the social conditions are going to change in the sense that more of them are going to be living in urban areas than rural areas. Now, what's going to come out of this is their culture. So now that they're going to be living in cities in big numbers, their music, their poetry, their literature is all going to start to come more to the forefront, spread by the newspaper and journalism and spread by the radio. Now, who do we have living in cities? We have white literature people, educators, artists, musicians, dancers, opera singers, whatever they might be. They are going to recognize talent. See, an artist looks at art and says, that's good art. Or an author reads a book of another person and says, that's a good book. They care less about what the color or religion of the person actually is. They care about the work itself. They're more of a purist in that sense. So as a result, the jazz age is going to begin. That's largely created by the black community who I think fused blues music and I think, church music to create jazz. All right. And it's going to be pushed by white intellectuals and published in the white presses. Broadway, which I'm sure you've all seen Broadway plays, they're going to allow for black actors in serious roles. Now, this isn't going on anywhere else in the country except places like New York and Chicago. But when it gets picked up in the newspapers that go all over the place, and it gets picked up on the radio that's heard all over the place, it's going to become more normal to have black people driving the culture. All right? So blacks are going to be looking to search their roots and expressing themselves through art, literature, poetry, music, drama, and dance. Theater is going to flourish in Harlem that are black operated. Now, black people they're 13% of the culture of the population today, but they do drive culture. Athletes, okay? Many athletes who are black are some of the most followed people on Instagram and Snapchat and rappers. All right, you guys all look up to them. You guys look up to black athletes. Now, you may not have many black friends, but you have many black cultural influences. All right, that thing is, and it's much bigger today, but that thing is going to start in the 1920s through their movement to cities where they're able to get their culture out there to more people. All right, let's end there today. I will post these videos for you guys to watch, and I will speak to you tomorrow. See you later.